Picture a world where massive reptiles the size of school buses roam through steamy jungles, where the air is so thick with oxygen you could literally get drunk just breathing, where flowers don't exist yet but 40-foot-long crocodiles lurk in every river. This isn't science fiction. This was Earth 150 million years ago. And if you think you know what the Mesozoic era looked like, you're probably wrong about everything. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's literally why I make them. So, subscribe maybe and tell me where you are and what time. I check comments and it's like Berlin at breakfast, Boston at bedtime, all at once. We're going back, way back, to a time when Earth was so alien, so completely different from today, that if you could somehow travel there, you'd think you'd landed on another planet entirely. This is the story of the Mesozoic era, 252 to 66 million years ago, when life exploded into forms so bizarre, so magnificent, and so terrifying that they still capture our imagination today. But here's what nobody tells you about the age of dinosaurs. It wasn't one world. It was three completely different worlds, each more alien than the last. And the story of how Earth transformed from a nearly lifeless wasteland into the most biodiverse planet in the solar system is stranger than any movie Hollywood has ever made. The journey starts with the greatest mass extinction in Earth's history. 252 million years ago, life on our planet came closer to ending than it ever had before or since. The Permian-Triassic extinction event, what scientists call the Great Dying, wiped out 96% of all marine species and 70% of all terrestrial vertebrates. To put that in perspective, imagine walking through a forest where 19 out of every 20 animals you see just vanish forever. Then imagine the same thing happening in the oceans, in the rivers, in the soil. It was so devastating that it took life 10 million years just to begin recovering. Scientists still debate what caused the Great Dying, but the most likely culprit was massive volcanic activity in what is now Siberia. The Siberian Traps volcanic eruptions lasted for thousands of years, pumping enormous quantities of carbon dioxide, methane, and toxic gases into the atmosphere. Ocean chemistry changed so dramatically that marine ecosystems collapsed. Acid rain fell for decades. The ozone layer was damaged. Global temperatures rose by up to 15 degrees Celsius. It was planetary murder on an unimaginable scale. But from that devastation came something unprecedented, a blank canvas, an empty world waiting to be filled with new forms of life. And the creatures that evolved to fill it were unlike anything that had come before. The Triassic period, 252 to 201 million years ago, was Earth's recovery room. The planet was hot, dry, and mostly desert, with a single massive supercontinent called Pangaea stretching from pole to pole. Imagine a world where you could theoretically walk from New York to Beijing without crossing an ocean. The interior of this supercontinent was a brutal desert larger than modern Africa, with temperatures that regularly exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit. No grass existed yet, no flowers. The landscape was dominated by ferns, cycads, and conifer forests that looked more like alien gardens than anything we'd recognize today. These weren't forests as we know them. Conifers during the Triassic grew in bizarre shapes, with some species reaching heights of 150 feet, but having trunks only 3 feet across, creating landscapes that looked like giant matchsticks scattered across the horizon. Ferns grew to the size of modern trees, creating dense undergrowth that harbored creatures we can barely imagine. Some ferns had trunks like palm trees, others spread across the ground in vast carpets that could stretch for miles without interruption. The cycads were perhaps the strangest plants of all. They looked somewhat like palm trees, but were actually more closely related to modern pines. Some species had massive seed cones that weighed over 80 pounds and contained seeds the size of chicken eggs. These plants dominated vast areas of the Triassic landscape, creating alien-looking forests where every tree was topped with what appeared to be a giant pineapple. Into this strange world came the first dinosaurs. But they weren't the massive creatures we usually picture. The earliest dinosaurs were small, agile, bipedal animals about the size of chickens. Eoraptor, one of the first dinosaurs discovered, was only 3 feet long and weighed about 20 pounds. It had long legs for running, sharp teeth for eating meat, and grasping hands with claws, but nothing about it suggested the giants that would come later. These early dinosaurs shared their world with much larger predators, massive crocodile-like archosaurs that ruled the land while dinosaurs scurried in the shadows waiting for their moment. Saurosuchus was a 23-foot-long predator that looked like a crocodile crossed with a tyrannosaur. It had a skull 3 feet long, filled with teeth the size of railroad spikes. Postosuchus was another giant predator that could rear up on its hind legs to reach heights of 15 feet, using massive claws to tear apart prey. These archosaurs weren't primitive reptiles. They had sophisticated metabolisms, complex social behaviors, and hunting strategies that would make modern crocodiles look simple by comparison. Some species hunted in packs, others were ambush predators, and a few even showed evidence of parental care that lasted for months after their young hatched. But the early dinosaurs had several advantages that would eventually pay off. They were warm-blooded, or at least had much faster metabolisms than their competitors. They could remain active during cooler parts of the day when the large archosaurs were sluggish. They were also more efficient walkers, with legs positioned directly under their bodies instead of sprawled out to the sides like crocodiles. That moment came at the end of the Triassic, when another mass extinction wiped out most of the large archosaurs and opened up ecological niches that dinosaurs quickly filled. The Triassic-Jurassic extinction event wasn't as severe as the Great Dying, but it eliminated about 76% of all species and fundamentally changed the rules of life on land. Massive volcanic eruptions in the central Atlantic region pumped carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, causing global warming and ocean acidification. The large predators that had dominated the Triassic couldn't adapt quickly enough to survive the changing climate. By the time the Jurassic period began 201 million years ago, dinosaurs had inherited the Earth. But the Earth they inherited was transforming before their eyes into something that would make even the alien Triassic world look familiar. The Jurassic period was when our planet became a greenhouse world unlike anything in human experience. Carbon dioxide levels were 3 to 4 times higher than today, reaching concentrations of 1,200 to 1,500 parts per million compared to our current 420 parts per million. There were no polar ice caps. Palm trees grew in Alaska. Ocean temperatures were so warm that marine life thrived in the Arctic Ocean, with water temperatures reaching 68 degrees Fahrenheit at the North Pole. To understand how different this was, consider that modern Arctic Ocean temperatures barely reach above freezing. Imagine swimming in waters off the coast of Greenland that feel like a heated pool. This wasn't just a warmer version of our world. This was a fundamentally different planet operating under completely different climatic rules. This greenhouse effect created a world of incredible abundance. The higher CO2 levels acted like fertilizer for plant life, creating what scientists call the CO2 fertilization effect. Plants could photosynthesize faster and more efficiently than anything in the modern world. Forests exploded across the continents, creating vast jungles filled with towering conifers, massive ferns, and cycads that looked like palm trees but weren't related to anything alive today. These weren't just bigger versions of modern forests. They were entirely different ecosystems operating under their own unique rules. Individual conifer trees could reach heights of 200 feet, with trunks 12 feet in diameter. A single tree contained more biomass than entire modern forest stands. Fern prairies stretched for hundreds of miles, with individual fern plants reaching heights of 40 feet and creating dense canopies that blocked out sunlight from the forest floor. The forest floor itself was unlike anything in the modern world. Instead of the thin layer of decaying leaves we see in contemporary forests, Jurassic forest floors were covered with accumulations of plant matter several feet thick. This created a spongy, nutrient-rich substrate that supported an incredible diversity of small reptiles, early mammals, and invertebrates. Some paleontologists estimate that the biomass per acre in Jurassic forests was 3 to 4 times higher than in modern tropical rainforests. And in these forests, life grew to sizes that seem impossible by modern standards. Sauropod dinosaurs like Brachiosaurus and Diplodocus stretched over 100 feet long and weighed as much as modern blue whales. Brachiosaurus could reach heights of 50 feet, taller than a 4-story building. Its heart alone weighed over 400 pounds and had to generate enough pressure to pump blood up a neck that was 30 feet long. These weren't just big animals, they were living skyscrapers, with necks so long they could browse treetops 40 feet above the ground. Their footprints were so massive that when paleontologists first discovered them, they thought they'd found elephant tracks. A single Brachiosaurus footprint measures 3 feet across and creates an impression in stone that looks like a small crater. But even more incredible was how these giants lived. Modern large mammals like elephants spend 16 hours a day eating just to maintain their body weight. An adult elephant needs to consume 300 to 400 pounds of plant matter daily just to survive. How did sauropods, which were many times larger than elephants, get enough food to survive? The answer lies in that alien Jurassic atmosphere. With CO2 levels so high, plants grew faster and larger than anything in the modern world. Conifer forests stretched unbroken across entire continents. A single tree might tower 200 feet high with a trunk 10 feet across. Ferns grew to the size of modern oak trees. There was so much plant biomass that even creatures the size of sauropods could find enough food by simply walking through the forest, eating everything in their path. Recent research has shown that sauropods had incredibly efficient digestive systems. They swallowed gastroliths, smooth stones that acted like millstones in their stomachs, grinding plant matter into easily digestible pulp. Their intestines were over 100 feet long, creating massive fermentation chambers where bacteria could break down even the toughest plant fibers. Some species could extract nutrients from plant matter so efficiently that they could gain weight-eating vegetation that would starve modern herbivores. But the plant life wasn't the only thing that grew to enormous size. The herbivores were matched by equally impressive predators. Allosaurus, the apex predator of the Jurassic, was a 30-foot-long killing machine with teeth like steak knives and claws that could disembowel a sauropod with a single swipe. But Allosaurus wasn't just big, it was perfectly engineered for hunting giant herbivores. Its skull was 3 feet long but surprisingly light, filled with air pockets that reduced weight without sacrificing strength. Its teeth were serrated like steak knives and curved backward to prevent prey from escaping once bitten. Its arms, though small compared to its body, were incredibly powerful, with claws that could penetrate hide several inches thick. Most importantly, it had the intelligence and social behavior necessary to hunt creatures many times its own size. Evidence from Allosaurus bone beds suggests these predators may have hunted in packs, coordinating their attacks to bring down enormous sauropods. Bite marks on sauropod bones show attack patterns consistent with multiple predators working together, some attacking the legs and flanks while others went for the neck and head. This would have been pack hunting on a scale that dwarfs anything in the modern world. Imagine wolf packs the size of city buses working together to bring down prey the size of apartment buildings. But Allosaurus was just the beginning. As the Jurassic progressed into the Cretaceous period 145 million years ago, predators evolved to sizes that dwarf anything alive today. The Cretaceous period, 145 to 66 million years ago, was when Earth reached peak weirdness. This was the longest period in the Mesozoic era, lasting almost 80 million years, and during that time, our planet became something that would be unrecognizable to modern eyes. The supercontinent Pangaea had finally broken apart, and the pieces were drifting toward their modern positions, but incredibly slowly. Continental drift during the Cretaceous moved at rates of only a few inches per year, so the world map still looked alien compared to today. North America was split in half by a shallow sea called the Western Interior Seaway that stretched from the Gulf of Mexico to the Arctic Ocean. This seaway was up to 600 miles wide and 2,500 feet deep, effectively creating two separate continents where we now have one. Europe was a scattered archipelago of tropical islands, more like modern Indonesia than the connected landmass we know today. Africa was separated from South America by a much narrower Atlantic Ocean. India was still an island continent drifting northward toward its eventual collision with Asia. Antarctica was ice-free and covered in forests, with average temperatures that would feel comfortable to modern humans. Ocean levels were 500 feet higher than today. To put that in perspective, most of Florida would have been underwater. The entire central United States would have been a shallow sea. London would have been an island. Paris would have been underwater. Most of what we now call dry land was submerged beneath warm, tropical oceans. These weren't just higher sea levels. The oceans themselves were fundamentally different from today. There was no thermohaline circulation, the current system that moves cold water from the poles to the equator. Instead, warm water circulated freely from pole to pole, creating a global ocean system with temperatures that rarely dropped below 60 degrees Fahrenheit anywhere on the planet. The coastlines were completely different, with vast, shallow seas covering the interiors of continents. These warm, shallow waters became breeding grounds for some of the most spectacular marine life ever to exist. The Western Interior Seaway alone contained marine ecosystems more diverse than the modern Mediterranean, with species that pushed the boundaries of what we thought was possible in aquatic environments. Mosasaurs, marine reptiles that looked like giant crocodiles with flippers, grew to lengths of 50 feet and more. Tylosaurus was 56 feet long, larger than a modern sperm whale, with a skull 6 feet long filled with teeth the size of bananas. But unlike crocodiles, which are primarily ambush predators, mosasaurs were active pursuit predators, capable of sustained high-speed swimming across entire ocean basins. Their flippers were perfectly adapted for aquatic locomotion, with specialized joints that allowed for both power and flexibility. Their tails were equipped with vertical flukes like modern whales, giving them the ability to generate tremendous thrust for rapid acceleration. Some species had binocular vision that allowed for precise depth perception when hunting fast-moving prey. Plesiosaurs with necks longer than their entire bodies cruised the seas like aquatic giraffes. Elasmosaurus had a neck 25 feet long containing 72 vertebrae, more than any other animal that has ever lived. It could extend its head 25 feet in any direction while its body remained motionless, allowing it to approach prey without creating water disturbances that might alert potential victims. But perhaps even more impressive were the shorter-necked plesiosaurs like Leadsichthys, which grew to lengths of over 55 feet and weighed more than 45 tons. These giants were filter feeders, like modern baleen whales, but they used specialized teeth instead of baleen to strain plankton from the water. Their feeding strategy was so efficient that they could maintain their enormous body size eating organisms smaller than modern goldfish. Giant marine turtles the size of small cars paddled through waters warm enough for coral reefs to grow in what is now Alaska. Archelon was 12 feet long and weighed over 5,000 pounds, making it larger than most modern cars. Its shell wasn't solid like modern turtles, but was instead composed of a framework of bones covered with leathery skin, making it lighter and more flexible for swimming in deep water. But the real revolution was happening on land, where flowering plants were changing the world forever. Before the Cretaceous, Earth's plant life was dominated by gymnosperms like conifers, ferns, and cycads. The world was green, yes, but monotonously green. There were no bright colors, no seasonal changes in foliage, no fruit, no flowers to attract pollinators. Then, around 130 million years ago, the first flowering plants, angiosperms, appeared. The earliest flowers were small and inconspicuous, probably wind-pollinated like modern grasses. But within 50 million years, they had completely transformed the planet's terrestrial ecosystems through what scientists call the angiosperm radiation, one of the most rapid evolutionary explosions in Earth's history. Suddenly the world exploded in color. Red, yellow, purple, orange. Flowers appeared everywhere as plants began competing for the attention of pollinating insects. This wasn't just a cosmetic change. It represented a fundamental shift in how terrestrial ecosystems functioned. For the first time in Earth's history, plants and animals were entering into complex cooperative relationships that benefited both partners. Bees evolved alongside flowering plants, developing specialized body parts for collecting nectar and pollen. Their fuzzy bodies could carry pollen between flowers, enabling plants to reproduce more efficiently than wind pollination alone. In return, plants provided bees with high-energy nectar and protein-rich pollen. This mutualistic relationship was so successful that it quickly spread to include hundreds of thousands of species. But bees weren't the only insects that co-evolved with flowers. Butterflies developed long proboscises that could reach nectar in deep flowers. Beetles evolved specialized mouthparts for eating pollen. Flies became important pollinators for flowers that bloomed early in the season before bees became active. Some flowers evolved to mimic the pheromones of female insects, tricking males into attempting to mate with them and thereby transferring pollen. Within 20 million years of their first appearance, flowering plants had developed an incredible diversity of reproductive strategies. Some flowers were massive, like modern magnolias, designed to attract large beetles that could carry pollen over long distances. Others were tiny and produced in enormous quantities, like modern grasses, designed for wind pollination in open habitats. Fruit trees appeared, offering sweet rewards to animals that would spread their seeds. This created entirely new ecological relationships. Dinosaurs began eating fruits and dispersing seeds in their droppings, sometimes carrying them hundreds of miles from the parent plant. Some trees evolved fruits specifically sized for different types of dinosaur mouths, creating co-evolutionary relationships between plants and herbivores that we can still see in the fossil record. But perhaps most importantly for the future of terrestrial ecosystems, grasses evolved during the Cretaceous. For the first time in Earth's history, there were vast grasslands, prairie ecosystems that could support enormous herds of herbivorous dinosaurs. These grasslands changed everything, creating new ecological niches and driving the evolution of some of the most spectacular dinosaur species ever discovered. Grass wasn't just another plant. It was a revolutionary life form that could tolerate grazing, trampling, and fire in ways that no previous plants could. Individual grass plants could lose their above-ground portions and regrow from their roots. They could spread through underground rhizome systems, creating vast prairies that functioned like single, enormous organisms. These grasslands supported herbivore populations that dwarf anything in the modern world. Vast herds of duck-billed dinosaurs migrated across the Cretaceous prairies in groups that may have numbered in the millions. Fossil evidence from the Hell Creek Formation shows bone beds containing the remains of thousands of individual hadrosaurs, suggesting herd sizes comparable to the great wildebeest migrations of modern Africa, but with animals that were each the size of modern elephants. This was the world that produced Tyrannosaurus rex, the most famous predator in Earth's history. T-Rex wasn't just big, it was perfectly engineered for killing the largest herbivores that ever lived. At 40 feet long and weighing up to 9 tons, it had the strongest bite force of any terrestrial animal ever measured. Computer models suggest its bite could generate up to 57,000 pounds of force per square inch, enough to crush a small car. Its teeth were the size of bananas, but they weren't just scaled-up versions of smaller predator teeth. They were specifically designed for crushing bone and tearing through the toughest hide. The front teeth were thin and sharp for precision cutting, while the back teeth were thick and powerful for crushing. This dental arrangement allowed T-Rex to bite through the thick skin and heavy bones of armored herbivores that would have been invulnerable to smaller predators. But T-Rex wasn't just a mindless killing machine. Recent research has revealed that it had one of the most sophisticated sensory systems of any predator that ever lived. Its brain was large relative to its body size, with enlarged regions devoted to processing smell, sight, and hearing. Its sense of smell may have been better than that of modern vultures, allowing it to detect carrion from miles away. Its vision was even more impressive. T-Rex had forward-facing eyes that provided excellent depth perception, crucial for a predator that needed to accurately judge distances when attacking fast-moving prey. Its eyes were larger than modern human eyes and may have been capable of seeing in much lower light conditions, giving it an advantage when hunting during dawn and dusk hours when many herbivores were most active. But perhaps most remarkably, T-Rex appears to have been intelligent enough to use sophisticated hunting strategies. Fossil evidence suggests they may have hunted in family groups, with adults and juveniles working together to bring down prey. Bite marks on hadrosaur bones show patterns consistent with coordinated attacks, with some predators attacking from the front while others attacked from behind. But T-Rex shared its world with herbivores that were equally impressive in their own ways. Triceratops, with its massive 3-horned skull and protective frill, was like a living tank weighing up to 12 tons. Its skull alone was over 7 feet long and equipped with horns that could reach lengths of 3 feet. But this wasn't just defensive equipment. Evidence from damaged Triceratops skulls suggests they used their horns in intra-specific combat, fighting each other for territory and mates in battles that must have been spectacular to witness. The frill behind Triceratops' head wasn't just for show either. It was a complex structure that served multiple functions. The bony frill provided attachment points for massive jaw muscles, giving Triceratops one of the most powerful bite forces of any herbivore. The frill was also covered with blood vessels that could be used for thermoregulation, helping the animal maintain its body temperature in the variable Cretaceous climate. Ankylosaurus was covered head to tail in bony armor and carried a massive club on its tail that could shatter the leg bones of any predator foolish enough to attack it. The tail club alone weighed over 100 pounds and could be swung with enough force to break the bones of a T-Rex. But Ankylosaurus wasn't just passively armored, it was an active defender that could use its low center of gravity and powerful legs to spin quickly and strike attackers with pinpoint accuracy. The armor covering Ankylosaurus wasn't just random bony plates, it was an integrated defensive system with different types of armor optimized for different parts of the body. The back was covered with large, flat plates that could deflect bite attacks. The sides had smaller, more flexible armor that allowed for movement while still providing protection. Even the eyelids were armored, giving Ankylosaurus protection against attacks aimed at its most vulnerable features. These weren't just big animals living in an empty world. The Cretaceous period saw the evolution of complex ecosystems more diverse than anything before or since. Fossil sites like the Hell Creek Formation in Montana have revealed communities containing over 40 species of dinosaurs living in the same area at the same time. Forests contained hundreds of species of dinosaurs, from tiny feathered creatures the size of sparrows to massive sauropods that made even T-Rex look small. The smallest dinosaurs were every bit as remarkable as the giants. Microraptor was only 2 feet long but had 4 wings and could glide between trees like a modern flying squirrel. Its feathers show iridescent patterns that would have created brilliant color displays, suggesting that even tiny dinosaurs engaged in complex social behaviors and visual communication. Carnotaurus, a predator from South America, had horns above its eyes and arms so reduced they didn't even have hands, just small stubs. But its legs were built for speed, with proportions that suggest it could run faster than any large predator alive today. Computer models indicate Carnotaurus may have been capable of sustained speeds of 35 miles per hour, fast enough to run down almost any prey animal in its ecosystem. And here's something that would blow your mind if you could see it. Many of these dinosaurs were covered in feathers, not just small ones. Recent fossil discoveries have shown that even some large predators had elaborate feathered displays. Tyrannus, a relative of T-Rex that lived in China, was 30 feet long and covered in downy feathers for insulation. The feathers were simple, more like modern bird down than flight feathers, but they covered the entire animal in a fuzzy coat that would have made it look more like a giant bird than a traditional reptile. Smaller predators like Velociraptor had feathers arranged in complex patterns for display and possibly flight. Velociraptor wasn't actually the 6-foot-tall monster depicted in movies. The real animal was only about 2 feet tall and 6 feet long, roughly the size of a large dog. But it was covered in feathers that may have been brightly colored and arranged in patterns used for species recognition and courtship displays. The line between dinosaurs and birds wasn't clear because birds are dinosaurs. They evolved from small theropod dinosaurs during the Jurassic, and by the Cretaceous, the skies were filled with both primitive birds and flying reptiles called pterosaurs. The distinction between feathered dinosaurs and early birds was often arbitrary, based more on whether the animal could fly than on any fundamental anatomical differences. Early birds like Hesperornis were 6 feet long and completely flightless, more like feathered dolphins than anything we would recognize as a bird today. They had teeth instead of beaks and spent their entire lives in the ocean, using their wings as flippers for underwater swimming. Other early birds like Ichthyornis could fly, but still retained teeth and other primitive features that linked them clearly to their dinosaur ancestry. Pterosaurs were not dinosaurs, but they shared the skies with early birds in the most spectacular way imaginable. Some pterosaurs grew to sizes that seem impossible for flying animals. Quetzalcoatlus had a wingspan of nearly 40 feet, making it larger than a small airplane. Standing on the ground, it would have been as tall as a modern giraffe, with a neck long enough to reach second-story windows. But Quetzalcoatlus wasn't just big. It was an incredibly sophisticated flying machine. Its bones were hollow and filled with air sacs that made them lighter than bird bones. Its wings were supported by a single enormously elongated finger that could fold the wing against its body when not in flight. It had excellent eyesight and a brain large enough to process the complex spatial information necessary for soaring flight. Recent research suggests that Quetzalcoatlus and other giant pterosaurs were primarily terrestrial hunters that used their ability to fly to cover large territories in search of prey. They may have hunted like modern storks, walking through shallow water and grabbing fish, small dinosaurs, and other prey with their long beaks. Their size would have made them dominant predators in any ecosystem they inhabited, capable of taking prey as large as juvenile dinosaurs. But the most alien thing about the Mesozoic world wasn't the giant reptiles. It was the environment itself. The atmospheric composition was completely different from today. Oxygen levels fluctuated between 15% and 23% throughout the Mesozoic compared to our current stable 21%. During periods of high oxygen, the air would have felt thick and energizing, like breathing from an oxygen tank. During low oxygen periods, physical exertion would have been more difficult, similar to being at high altitude. Carbon dioxide levels were consistently much higher than today, sometimes reaching 2,000 parts per million or more. This created a greenhouse effect so powerful that the entire planet operated under different climatic rules. There were no permanent ice caps anywhere on Earth for most of the Mesozoic. Even the poles had temperate climates with forests and rivers that never froze. The lack of ice caps meant that weather patterns were completely different from today. Without cold polar air masses to create the jet stream and other modern weather phenomena, the Mesozoic world had much more stable, predictable weather. Seasonal changes were minimal, except in terms of rainfall. Many regions had only wet and dry seasons rather than the four-season pattern we're familiar with. This stability allowed ecosystems to develop complexity that we can barely imagine. The fossil record from the Cretaceous shows forests with more plant diversity than modern tropical rainforests. Single fossil sites have revealed over 100 species of plants, creating ecosystems where every available ecological niche was filled by specialized organisms. Dinosaur communities contained dozens of species living in the same areas, each specialized for different food sources and different ways of life. There were dinosaur species that lived entirely in trees, others that were semi-aquatic, some that hunted in packs, others that were solitary ambush predators. There were herbivores that fed on high tree branches, others that specialized in ground-level plants, some that ate nothing but ferns, others that preferred cycads or early flowering plants. This wasn't just a world of giant monsters, it was a world of incredible ecological sophistication where every possible way of making a living had been explored and refined by evolution. The level of specialization was so extreme that paleontologists can often determine a dinosaur's diet and lifestyle just from the shape of its teeth or the proportions of its limbs. Some hadrosaurs had hundreds of tiny teeth arranged in grinding surfaces that could process the toughest plant fibers. Others had fewer, larger teeth designed for cutting softer vegetation. Ceratopsians had sharp, shearing teeth perfect for slicing through cycad fronds. Sauropods had simple peg-like teeth that they used only for stripping leaves, swallowing plant matter whole and letting their massive digestive systems break it down. The predators were equally specialized. Some theropods had long, narrow skulls and thin teeth designed for catching fish. Others had massive, robust skulls and thick teeth for crushing bone. Some had long arms with powerful claws for grappling with prey, while others had reduced arms and relied entirely on their powerful jaws for killing. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about the Mesozoic era was how it ended. 66 million years ago, Earth was at the height of biodiversity. Dinosaur species were more numerous and more varied than they had ever been. The climate was stable and warm. Ecosystems were mature and complex. Life seemed to have figured out the perfect formula for success. Then, in a single day, it all ended. The asteroid that struck Earth 66 million years ago was roughly 6 miles across and traveling at about 43,000 miles per hour when it hit what is now the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. The impact site, now called the Chicxulub crater, is 110 miles in diameter and represents one of the most violent events in Earth's history. To understand the scale of this impact, imagine an object the size of Manhattan traveling at 60 times the speed of sound and hitting the Earth with the force of 10 billion atomic bombs exploding simultaneously. The impact released energy equivalent to 100 trillion tons of TNT, more energy than humans have used in all of recorded history. But the asteroid itself wasn't what killed the dinosaurs. It was what happened next. The impact threw billions of tons of debris into the atmosphere. Rock that had been vaporized by the impact condensed into tiny glass spherules that rained down across the entire planet. Within hours, the entire planet was shrouded in darkness as vaporized rock and dust blocked out the sun. The immediate effects were catastrophic. The impact generated earthquakes larger than anything in recorded history. Tsunami waves over 300 feet high swept across coastlines thousands of miles from the impact site. Forest fires ignited by falling debris burned across entire continents. The air itself became hot enough to kill any animal that couldn't find shelter underground or underwater. But these immediate effects, devastating as they were, lasted only days or weeks. The real killer was what scientists call impact winter. The dust and debris thrown into the atmosphere blocked out sunlight for months, maybe years. Global temperatures plummeted, photosynthesis stopped, plants died, herbivores starved, predators had nothing to hunt. This impact winter lasted for months, maybe years. When the dust finally settled and the sun shone again, the world had changed forever. An estimated 76% of all species went extinct, including all non-avian dinosaurs. The age of reptiles was over. The age of mammals had begun. But here's what makes the story even more incredible. Some dinosaurs survived. Birds, being small and capable of flight, made it through the extinction event. They could find shelter in caves or burrows during the immediate impact effects. They could fly long distances to find food during the impact winter. Most importantly, they could adapt their diets to whatever was available, eating seeds, insects, and small animals that other creatures couldn't or wouldn't eat. Today, there are more species of birds than any other group of land vertebrates. Over 10,000 species of birds populate the planet, from tiny hummingbirds to massive ostriches. In a very real sense, we still live in the age of dinosaurs. We just don't usually think of robins and eagles as dinosaurs. The mammals that inherited the Earth after the extinction were tiny creatures, most no larger than rats, that had spent the entire Mesozoic era living in the shadows of the great reptiles. For over 160 million years, mammals had remained small, probably because any attempt to grow larger would have put them in direct competition with dinosaurs for the same ecological niches. But within 10 million years of the dinosaurs' extinction, mammals had diversified into forms that filled every ecological niche the dinosaurs had occupied. Some became massive herbivores like the uintathares, elephant-sized browsers with bizarre horn arrangements on their skulls. Others became efficient predators like the creodonts, wolf-like carnivores that dominated terrestrial ecosystems for millions of years. Some mammals took to the trees, evolving into the primates that would eventually lead to humans. Others took to the oceans, becoming whales and dolphins. Some became flying creatures, evolving into bats that could compete with birds for aerial niches. Within 50 million years, mammals had produced giants that rivaled the largest dinosaurs. But they never quite achieved the same combination of size, diversity, and ecological dominance that characterized the Mesozoic era. Looking back at those 186 million years from 252 to 66 million years ago, it's hard to grasp just how alien that world was. Every aspect of it was different from today. The continents were in different positions. The climate was completely unlike anything in human experience. The atmospheric composition was foreign to our lungs. The plant life was dominated by species that are now extinct or relegated to small refugia. And yet, it was during this alien time that many of the fundamental patterns of modern life were established. The Mesozoic era was Earth's great experiment in biological gigantism. It was a time when life, freed from the constraints of ice ages and mass extinctions, could explore the upper limits of size, complexity, and diversity. certainty we'll never see its like again. The asteroid impact of 66 million years ago wasn't just the end of the dinosaurs, it was the end of a particular way that life could exist on Earth. The greenhouse world, the stable climate, the enormous size of individual organisms, all of that ended with the impact winter and never returned. But to really understand how alien the Mesozoic world was, we need to go deeper into the details of daily life during those incredible 186 million years. Imagine waking up in the Middle Jurassic 170 million years ago, somewhere in what would eventually become Colorado. The first thing you'd notice is the air. It's thick, almost syrupy, with 30% more oxygen than you're used to. Each breath fills your lungs with an energy you've never felt before. It's like breathing pure mountain air mixed with pure oxygen from a tank. But there's something else in that air, a sweetness you can't quite identify, and an underlying earthiness that comes from plant decay happening at rates impossible in the modern world. The humidity is crushing, like being inside a greenhouse, but this greenhouse covers the entire continent. Your skin would be constantly damp with moisture, and every surface would be covered in a thin film of condensation. The sounds would be unlike anything in the modern world. No bird songs as we know them, because most modern bird groups haven't evolved yet. Instead, the air is filled with the calls of pterosaurs, sounds that range from high-pitched screeches to deep, resonant booms that carry for miles. In the distance, you might hear the massive footsteps of sauropods, each step creating a sound like thunder as 50-ton animals move through the forest. The ground itself would shake periodically as herds of massive herbivores moved through the area. Earthquakes were common, not from tectonic activity alone, but from the simple fact that animals weighing as much as modern blue whales were walking around on dry land. Imagine the vibrations created by a herd of 20 Brachiosaurus moving through a forest, each animal weighing 80 tons. The plant life around you would be simultaneously familiar and completely alien. The trees are recognizable as conifers, but they're growing in shapes and sizes that defy modern botanical understanding. Some are 300 feet tall with trunks only 4 feet in diameter, creating an alien forest of living telephone poles. Others have grown into bizarre shapes with multiple trunks branching from a single root system, creating natural cathedrals of interwoven wood and foliage. The undergrowth is dominated by ferns, but these aren't the small, delicate ferns of modern forests. These are tree ferns 60 feet tall with fronds the size of small buildings. Walking through this forest would be like navigating a jungle where every plant is scaled up to impossible sizes. Individual fern fronds create natural bridges between trees, some strong enough to support the weight of small dinosaurs. And everywhere, absolutely everywhere, there are dinosaurs, not just the giants you might expect, but creatures of every conceivable size and shape. Tiny feathered dinosaurs the size of sparrows dart through the undergrowth, hunting insects that are themselves larger than anything alive today. Medium-sized predators like Allosaurus move through the forest with the casual confidence of apex predators, while massive sauropods browse the treetops 50 feet above your head. The ecosystem operates on principles that would seem impossible today. The energy flow through this system is so efficient that it can support herbivores weighing 100 tons alongside predators weighing 10 tons, all living in the same relatively small area. Modern ecosystems can't support anything approaching this level of biomass because modern plant productivity, even in the richest tropical rainforests, is nowhere near the levels achieved during the Mesozoic greenhouse periods. But it's not just the size of individual organisms that would seem alien, it's the complexity of their interactions. Recent fossil discoveries have revealed behaviors in Mesozoic creatures that rival or exceed the most sophisticated behaviors seen in modern animals. Some dinosaur species built elaborate communal nesting grounds where hundreds of individuals would lay their eggs in carefully constructed mounds of rotting vegetation that generated heat through decomposition. These nesting grounds weren't just random collections of nests. They were carefully organized communities with distinct areas for different activities. Some areas were used exclusively for egg-laying, others for feeding hatchlings, still others for teaching young dinosaurs the skills they would need to survive as adults. The level of social organization required to maintain these communities suggests cognitive abilities that we typically associate only with the most intelligent modern animals. Some species showed evidence of what can only be called culture, behaviors that were learned and passed down through generations rather than being purely instinctual. Different populations of the same species in different geographic areas developed different tool use behaviors, different hunting strategies, even different social structures. This cultural transmission was so sophisticated that paleontologists can sometimes identify the geographic origin of fossil specimens based on subtle differences in behavior patterns preserved in the fossil record. The intelligence levels achieved by some Mesozoic creatures may have exceeded those of any modern animals. Troodon, a small theropod dinosaur, had a brain-to-body weight ratio that approached that of modern birds, combined with hands capable of manipulating objects with precision. Some researchers have suggested that if the asteroid impact hadn't occurred, species like Troodon might have eventually developed technology and possibly even primitive civilization. This isn't pure speculation. Troodon and related species showed evidence of complex problem-solving abilities, sophisticated social behaviors, and the capacity to use and modify tools for specific purposes. They had excellent night vision, suggesting they may have been active hunters during hours when most other dinosaurs were inactive. They appear to have lived in social groups with complex hierarchies and cooperative behaviors that extended beyond simple pack hunting. But intelligence wasn't limited to the smaller dinosaurs. Even the giants showed evidence of cognitive abilities that would be impressive in any era. Sauropod herds showed coordinated migration patterns that required planning and communication across distances of hundreds of miles. They established and maintained traditional migration routes that were used by multiple generations, suggesting cultural transmission of geographic knowledge. Some sauropod species engaged in behaviors that can only be called engineering. They modified their environments on a massive scale, creating clearings in forests, establishing and maintaining water sources, and even building what appear to be crude roads, well-worn paths that multiple herds used for efficient travel between feeding and watering areas. The predators were equally sophisticated. T-Rex and other large theropods showed evidence of cooperative hunting behaviors that required advanced communication and planning. They could coordinate attacks on prey much larger than themselves, with different individuals taking on specific roles in bringing down massive herbivores. But perhaps most remarkably, some predator species appear to have engaged in what we can only call warfare, organized conflicts between different groups that went far beyond simple territorial disputes. Fossil evidence from the Hell Creek Formation shows patterns of injury and death that suggest systematic battles between different T-Rex family groups, conflicts that may have lasted for days or even weeks. These weren't random encounters or simple competition for resources. The injury patterns and distribution of fossil remains suggest planned attacks, strategic positioning, and coordinated group tactics that required levels of intelligence and social organization that we typically associate only with the most advanced social mammals. The herbivores, meanwhile, developed defensive strategies that were equally sophisticated. Triceratops herds arranged themselves in formations that maximized their defensive capabilities, with adults positioned to protect juveniles and individuals with the largest horns taking positions where they could most effectively counter predator attacks. Some species developed what can only be called early warning systems, with designated individuals serving as sentries while the rest of the herd fed or rested. These sentries weren't just randomly alert animals, they were specialists with enhanced sensory capabilities who could detect predators at greater distances and communicate danger more effectively than typical herd members. The communication systems used by Mesozoic creatures were incredibly sophisticated. Many dinosaur species could produce and hear infrasonic calls, sounds below the range of human hearing that could travel for miles without being detected by most predators. These calls were used for long-distance coordination of herd movements, mating displays that could be heard across entire continents, and complex social interactions that we're only beginning to understand. Some species developed visual communication systems that rivaled the complexity of modern bird displays. Parasaurolophus and other crested hadrosaurs could produce a wide range of sounds through their elaborate crests, but they also used visual displays involving posture, movement, and possibly even color changes to communicate complex information to other members of their species. The ceratopsians took visual communication to even greater extremes. The frills of species like Triceratops weren't just defensive structures, they were complex display organs covered with patterns of color and texture that could be modified through changes in blood flow, muscle tension, and posture. Individual ceratopsians could probably communicate as much information through their frill displays as modern primates communicate through facial expressions and body language. But communication wasn't the only area where Mesozoic creatures achieved remarkable sophistication. Their tool use and environmental modification abilities were far more advanced than anything seen in modern animals except humans. Some dinosaur species routinely modified their environments on scales that would be impressive even by modern standards. Sauropods didn't just eat vegetation randomly. They practiced what we would now recognize as forest management, selectively removing certain plant species while encouraging the growth of others. Over millions of years, this selective browsing created entirely artificial plant communities that were more productive and nutritious than natural forests would have been. These managed forests covered thousands of square miles and represented some of the first large-scale environmental engineering projects in Earth's history. The sauropods had essentially created agricultural systems. Though they didn't plant crops in the traditional sense, they controlled entire ecosystems to maximize food production. Some predator species engaged in equally sophisticated environmental modifications. Certain theropods appear to have deliberately set forest fires to drive prey into areas where they could be hunted more effectively. They had learned that many herbivore species would flee fires by following predictable routes, and they positioned themselves along these routes to ambush fleeing animals. This wasn't opportunistic behavior. The timing and location of these fires suggests careful planning and coordination between multiple predator groups. Some fires appear to have been set months in advance of hunting seasons, allowing time for new growth to attract herbivores to specific areas where predators would be waiting. The aquatic reptiles of the Mesozoic were equally impressive in their intelligence and behavioral complexity. Plesiosaurs and mosasaurs developed hunting strategies that required cooperation between dozens of individuals across ocean basins hundreds of miles wide. They established and maintained hunting territories that were passed down through generations, with complex social hierarchies that determined access to the best feeding areas. Some marine reptile species engaged in what can only be called aquaculture. They deliberately managed populations of fish and marine invertebrates, protecting breeding areas during spawning seasons and harvesting adult populations in ways that ensured sustainable food supplies over long periods. These managed marine ecosystems were incredibly productive. Fossil evidence suggests that Mesozoic oceans supported biomass levels that were several times higher than modern oceans, largely because of the sophisticated management practices developed by intelligent marine reptiles. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Mesozoic life was the level of interspecific cooperation that developed between different types of animals. Modern ecosystems include examples of cooperation between different species, but nothing approaching the complexity and scale of relationships that existed during the age of reptiles. Some dinosaur species developed what we can only call symbiotic relationships with other dinosaur species. Small, agile predators would follow herds of large herbivores, not to hunt them, but to catch small animals disturbed by the movement of the herd. In return, these small predators would alert the herbivores to the presence of large predators, creating an early warning system that benefited both species. Some herbivore species formed mixed herds that included multiple species with different sensory capabilities and defensive strategies. Hadrosaurs with excellent hearing would team up with ceratopsians with better vision and armored ankylosaurs with superior defensive capabilities. These mixed herds were far more effective at detecting and repelling predator attacks than single-species groups. Even more remarkably, some species developed cooperative relationships that crossed the traditional predator-prey divide. Certain small theropods appear to have served as cleaners for large sauropods, removing parasites and dead skin in exchange for protection and access to insects disturbed by the sauropod's feeding activities. These cleaning relationships were so sophisticated that some theropod species appear to have specialized entirely for this lifestyle, developing specialized teeth and claws optimized for parasite removal rather than hunting. They lived their entire lives in association with sauropod herds, and their survival was completely dependent on maintaining cooperative relationships with animals that were theoretically their prey. The flying reptiles developed equally complex relationships with terrestrial animals. Some pterosaur species served as scouts for dinosaur herds, using their ability to fly to identify distant water sources, food supplies, and potential dangers. In return, they received protection and access to food sources that would have been unavailable to purely aerial hunters. These cooperative relationships were so important to ecosystem functioning that the extinction of key species could cause cascading effects throughout entire regions. When certain pterosaur species went extinct due to volcanic activity or climate changes, the dinosaur herds they served often followed them into extinction within a few thousand years. The marine ecosystems showed similar levels of interspecific cooperation. Some marine reptile species worked together with early birds to locate fish schools, with the birds providing aerial reconnaissance while the marine reptiles did the actual hunting. The birds received a share of the catch in exchange for their scouting services. These cooperative relationships were so complex and so crucial to ecosystem functioning that they created what ecologists call keystone networks, interconnected webs of species relationships that maintained the stability and productivity of entire biogeographic regions. When the asteroid impact occurred 66 million years ago, it wasn't just individual species that went extinct, it was these entire networks of relationships that were destroyed. The recovery of life after the extinction was slow, not just because so many species died, but because the complex cooperative relationships that had made Mesozoic ecosystems so productive had been completely disrupted. The mammals that inherited the Earth after the extinction were starting essentially from scratch in terms of developing complex, interspecific relationships. It took tens of millions of years for mammalian ecosystems to develop even simple cooperative relationships, and they never achieved anything approaching the complexity of the networks that existed during the Mesozoic. This is why modern ecosystems, despite containing millions of species, are generally less productive and less stable than Mesozoic ecosystems that contained far fewer species but much more complex relationships between those species. But the most profound difference between the Mesozoic world and our own wasn't the size of the animals or even the complexity of their behaviors. It was the fundamental stability of the entire Earth system. For nearly 200 million years, the planet operated under climatic conditions that were remarkably stable compared to anything in the modern world. There were no ice ages during the Mesozoic. Global temperatures varied by only a few degrees over millions of years. Sea levels remained relatively constant. The composition of the atmosphere changed slowly and predictably. This stability allowed life to develop long-term strategies that would be impossible in the rapidly changing world we inhabit today. Modern species have to be generalists, capable of adapting quickly to changing conditions, because our world changes too rapidly for extreme specialization to be a viable strategy. But Mesozoic species could afford to become incredibly specialized because they could count on their environment remaining essentially unchanged for millions of generations. This specialization reached levels that seem almost impossible by modern standards. Some dinosaur species were so perfectly adapted to specific environmental conditions that they could survive only in areas with very particular temperature ranges, humidity levels, and food availability. They were living precision instruments, perfectly tuned to extract maximum efficiency from their specific ecological niches. The result was a world where every possible way of making a living had been explored and optimized to an incredible degree. There were dinosaur species specialized for eating specific types of seeds, others that ate only certain species of ferns, still others that could survive only on the nectar of particular flowering plants. Some predator species were so specialized that they could hunt only specific prey species, using hunting techniques that were perfectly adapted to the behavior patterns and defensive capabilities of their chosen targets. These predators knew their prey so intimately that they could predict individual behavioral patterns and exploit tiny vulnerabilities that would be invisible to generalist hunters. The herbivores were equally specialized. Some species could extract nutrients from plant materials that would be toxic to any other animal. Others had evolved digestive systems so efficient that they could survive on plant materials with extremely low nutritional content, allowing them to exploit food sources that no other animals could use. This level of specialization created ecosystems with incredible efficiency. Energy flow through Mesozoic ecosystems was so optimized that they could support biomass levels that seem impossible by modern standards. Nothing was wasted. Every possible energy source was being exploited by species that were perfectly adapted to use it. But this efficiency came at a cost. When conditions changed rapidly, as they did during the asteroid impact, most of these specialists couldn't adapt quickly enough to survive. The generalists, the species that weren't perfectly adapted to any particular conditions but could survive in a wide range of environments, were the ones that made it through the extinction event. This is why the post-extinction world was dominated by small, unspecialized mammals rather than by any of the magnificent specialists that had ruled the Mesozoic. The mammals that survived were evolutionary Swiss Army knives, capable of eating almost anything, living in almost any environment, and adapting their behavior quickly when conditions changed. The world we inherited is a world optimized for change rather than stability, for adaptability rather than efficiency. In many ways, we live in a diminished world compared to the Mesozoic, a world where life has traded the incredible specialization and efficiency of the age of reptiles for the flexibility needed to survive in an unstable, rapidly changing environment. But we are the descendants of the survivors. The small mammals that made it through the extinction event were our ancestors, and we carry their genetic legacy of adaptability and resilience. Every time we adapt to new challenges, every time we solve problems using tools and intelligence rather than specialized anatomy, Every time we cooperate with others to achieve goals that would be impossible for individuals, we are expressing evolutionary strategies that first emerged in the small mammals hiding in the shadows of the dinosaurs. The Mesozoic world is gone forever. The asteroid impact of 66 million years ago didn't just end the age of reptiles. It ended a particular way that life could exist on Earth. The stable greenhouse world that allowed for such incredible specialization and efficiency will never return. Our planet is now locked into a pattern of ice ages and rapid climate change that makes the kind of long-term evolutionary optimization that characterized the Mesozoic impossible. But in some ways, we carry the legacy of that ancient world with us. The coal and oil that powered the Industrial Revolution are the compressed remains of Mesozoic forests. The limestone that forms many of our most beautiful mountains is built from the shells of Mesozoic marine organisms. Even our modern ecosystems are still shaped by evolutionary relationships that first developed during the age of reptiles. And sometimes, just sometimes, we get glimpses of what that world was like when we discover new fossils that reveal previously unknown aspects of Mesozoic life. Each new discovery adds another piece to the puzzle of understanding how life could reach such incredible heights of complexity and diversity under the right conditions. Standing in a natural history museum, looking up at the skeleton of a Tyrannosaurus rex or the impossibly long neck of a Brachiosaurus, we're not just looking at extinct animals. We're looking at representatives of the most successful experiment in complex life that our planet has ever produced. For nearly 200 million years, the Mesozoic world showed us what Earth is capable of when life has time and stability to explore the full range of possible forms. The next time you see a bird at your window, remember that you're looking at a living dinosaur, a direct descendant of the magnificent creatures that once ruled the Earth. And remember that the story of the Mesozoic isn't just ancient history, it's a reminder that life is capable of achieving heights of complexity and beauty that we can barely imagine given the right conditions and enough time. We may never again see animals as large as sauropods or ecosystems as complex as those that existed during the Cretaceous. But we carry within us the same evolutionary creativity that produced those marvels, the same capacity for adaptation, intelligence, and cooperation that allowed our mammalian ancestors to survive the greatest catastrophe in Earth's history. The Mesozoic era ended 66 million years ago, but its legacy lives on in every aspect of our modern world. We are all, in a very real sense, children of the age of reptiles.